And we're back. Picking up with some of the tensions leading to the Civil War. So some of the reasons why tensions are escalating, increasing between the North and the South in the 1850s. And leading up to this question for you to think about, was the Civil War inevitable? Was it bound to happen, or could it have possibly been avoided? We already talked about a few of these things with the Compromise of 1850 that made California a free state. This is going to come back to us in a bit, because California would have been under the Missouri Compromise half free, half slave. So that's a problem. California had become free, but a very harsh fugitive slave law had been enacted that put a responsibility on white people in the North to report anyone who was runaway. We talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin in the last video, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of that. And then left off here with some political stuff. All right, Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois. That's, let's see, minimize this for a second and pull up this, and so Illinois, just to spell that, well, that looks weird because it looks like 3 L's, but Illinois, senator. And at the time, trains were becoming more popular and technologically advanced. So, here was our map of the United States like in 1850. And in the early 1850s, you see Illinois here. It's a free state. They're working on extending train tracks out to California. Everyone wants a train track to go through their state. Here's the problem with Illinois. If it goes through Illinois, then you'd have to go through this unorganized territory. You can't just, go from New York City to Illinois and down and around. That doesn't make sense. So for it to go through Illinois, it'd have to go into this unorganized territory. There's no constitution in place. Local laws are vague. Law enforcement doesn't have the population to become a state. So that's a problem. You've got to make that area into state, or at least an official territory, in order to get a train to successfully run through that. Douglas also has political ambitions. If under the Missouri Compromise, refresher here, any new state above this line, Missouri's southern border, was supposed to become free. Well, if this stuff organizes into free territory, then that's going to get the political leaders of all of these pro-slavery states upset. So, Douglas doesn't want to upset that population because he has larger political ambitions. It's going to overthrow the balance in the Senate. And he's going to want to organize that territory, but he's not going to he's not going to want to adhere to the Missouri Compromise. So Douglas and others start to adhere to a policy known as popular sovereignty. People are sovereign over that territory. Douglas is kind of saying, nah, we don't need Congress to make that decision. Douglas is saying, okay, we're going to let the people living there decide on whether or not to allow slavery. So, that's going to get a lot of people supporting free territory upset, because you're basically ignoring the Missouri Compromise altogether. And this idea of popular sovereignty, by the way, was, I forgot to mention, the term was coined by another politician named Lewis Cass. But Douglas endorses this as well. So you're basically making the Missouri Compromise null and void. And Southerners are still going to be upset by this, because they feel like slavery should be allowed anywhere. Northerners are upset who don't endorse slavery and human bondage, because they say, well, under the Missouri Compromise, this was supposed to be free territory. So we end up with an act called the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So congressional act here. They've organized that previously unorganized territory into two places, the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. And the territories are supposed to vote on whether or not, the people who live there are supposed to vote on whether or not to allow slavery. Here's what happens. So these were both supposed to be free territories under the Missouri Compromise. Keep that in mind. What happens is we have a drama in Kansas, because there are going to be a bunch of people from Missouri who owned slaves who are going to say, you know what, this is kind of why you need voter ID. We're just going to go over into Kansas, say that we live here, vote for slavery, and then we're going to go back home. So you have this fraudulent election taking place in Kansas. And that creates chaos, because now you have Kansas voting to permit slavery. It was supposed to be free. It was a largely fraudulent election. And people are irate. After they find out it's a fraudulent election, Kansas ends up with two different governments, a pro-slavery government and an anti-slavery government. And it leads to all kinds of chaos with a situation known as Bleeding Kansas. I just said Kansas very southerly. Bleeding Kansas, here is this guy named John Brown, who we will see again. Brown is the other abolitionist that we've talked about, promoted peace. John Brown is a white guy who is willing to use violence. After a town in Kansas is kind of overturned and trashed by pro-slavery people from Missouri, John Brown goes in and he'll be responsible for the murder of several pro-slavery people. And for several years, there are many confrontations in Kansas over the issue of slavery. So it is a violent and bloody mess that we see happening, with people dying over these issues of slavery and fighting over whether slavery should be permitted in Kansas or not. Bleeding Kansas is going to spill over into other political stuff in Washington that we'll see in the next clip.